Welcome to the Happiness Festival in collaboration with Going Life. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Sandro Galea, who is a physician, epidemiologist. He has written several books. He is the Robert A. Knox Professor and the Dean at the Boston University School of Public Health. Sandro was named the Time Magazine's Epidemiology Innovators and has been listed as one of the world's most influential scientific minds. He has published widely in press, including the Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, the Boston Globe, and the New York Times. And he's a regular contributor to Fortune magazine alongside his scientific contributions. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Sandro Galea to our Happiness Festival.
I would like to start by talking about a word. It is perhaps not a word we often associate with resilience. That word is happiness. We all want happiness. We devote enormous resources to being able to live happy lives. In this sense, happiness is much like health. Also like health, happiness comes and goes. It is vulnerable to external events which can shock us out of happiness or reinforce the unhappiness we may already feel. This is never truer than when we are confronted with sudden large-scale trauma like COVID-19. Now, this pandemic has tested us in unprecedented ways. It has exposed areas where we are resilient and areas where we are less so. And it has thrown happiness into question for millions around the world, upending our collective fortunes. It is perhaps fitting that happiness is so deeply subject to fate. The root of the word happiness is hap, a Middle English word for fortune or chance. A wish for happiness was once a wish for good fortune. And it is to fortune that our minds often turn when thinking of resilience. We are transfixed by the randomness of disasters. We think resilience is a matter of whether or not the storm struck our house or the neighbors, whether or not we were beneath the building when it fell, whether or not we caught COVID-19. Now, it is true that there is much that is random about such events, but our resilience in the face of adversity is far less random than we think. Our hap is in fact rooted in the same social, economic, and political structures that decide our happiness. Here again, happiness recalls health. We often think health is defined by doctors and medicines, but doctors and medicines can only treat us when we are sick. Health is the state of not being sick to begin with. The World Health Organization defines health in the preamble to its constitution as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Creating this state means creating a social, economic, and political context where health can thrive. When we have health, we are then free, to quote another founding text, to pursue happiness. During COVID-19, populations which have not been free to pursue happiness have consistently been the most vulnerable. They are the communities that suffer from poverty and low income, that lack social capital, that bear the burden of deep health inequities. Creating a context where these populations can live healthy lives is core to promoting resilience. This means tackling the structural basis for their poor health and limited happiness. First, there is the influence of economic disadvantage. Money is deeply linked to our ability to enjoy a happy, healthy life, to enjoy what we might call good fortune, in both senses of the word. Just consider the fact that in the US, there is a nearly 14-year gap in life expectancy between the richest and poorest Americans. When the worst happens then, money often decides whether the people it is happening to are already healthy or suffering from the sickness that comes with low income or poverty. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, for example, poverty was found to be linked with post-traumatic stress in the affected region. Communities with greater economic advantage showed lower levels of PTSD. Building resilience means making sure as many people as possible have adequate financial resources. This calls for investment in the economic development of communities and for getting money directly to individuals and families. This can be done through the type of cash transfer seen in the recent US stimulus. This transfer reflects the common practice often carried out by private charities of rushing money to those affected by disasters. We need to apply this instinct to delivering money before disasters strike, investing in long-term resilience. Now, next is the importance of social capital in building resilience. Social capital is communities working together to provide mutual support, neighbors helping neighbors. This was especially true after the 2011 Japanese earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown, for example. Survivors said many lives were saved by the actions of the community. We have seen a similar, if less dramatic, dynamic at work during COVID-19, as social capital has helped mitigate the effects of isolation. Throughout the pandemic, communities have come together to check in, raise each other's spirits, and care for the vulnerable. New technologies have helped extend social capital into the digital space, allowing us to connect remotely. This has helped us deliver professional care to the isolating. And finally, there is the challenge of inequities, where some face greater risk of poor health than others. During COVID-19, inequities have really taken two key forms. First, there are the frontline workers, whose jobs keep them in positions of greater risk. These workers include doctors and nurses, hospital administrative staff, waiters lacking the option to telecommute, sanitation workers still pulling shifts, grocery clerks helping us keep us fed. Their resilience depends in large part on our making sure they have the resources to stay healthy, the pay, benefits, working conditions, and community support that reflect a society which fully honors their contribution. Then, there are the inequities driven by the conditions of marginalization we have allowed to proliferate. In the US, this has perhaps most visibly and painfully unfolded along the lines of race. Black Americans are more likely to get sick and die from COVID-19 than the broader population. The reason is a convergence of social, economic, and political factors rooted in historic injustice of slavery. These are the same conditions that enable racially motivated acts of police violence, such as the deaths of George Floyd and many others. The recent protests are a response to these conditions. They reflect a community whose resilience has long been tried. And they are a reminder that creating the conditions for resilience among populations ultimately means building a world where resilience is less necessary, where all can live healthy lives supported by a foundation of equity and justice. It is possible to look at the health gaps caused by inequities and think that they are just something that happens, simply bad luck. But when the structures that underlie them come into view, we see that they emerge from a choice that we as a society make. When we decide that some can pursue happiness and not others, we are deciding to leave some at greater risk of preventable disease. When the worst happens, such as a pandemic, these populations are denied the resilience enjoyed by the majority. Yet their vulnerability is ultimately ours. When we accept pockets of poor health in our society, we cannot call ourselves healthy, no matter how far removed from risk some of us may feel. The pandemic has made this clear. The virus has used long-standing health gaps to gain a foothold and ultimately threaten the health of everyone. Closing these gaps is one of the best ways we can build resilience to navigate this challenge and be better prepared for the next one. This means creating the conditions where all can live happy, healthy lives. There are no guarantees in life, but when we have money, a strong social network, and are not part of a marginalized group, it is much likelier we will live healthy in the best of times and muddle through better in the worst. Whether or not we have these advantages may seem a matter of luck, just as happiness can seem up to fate. Yet we can make our own luck when it comes to health. We can make sure no one faces undue economic hardship, we can cultivate social capital within communities, and we can end health inequities. It's also important to note that the work of creating this world, of maximizing happiness for others, is itself a source of great happiness. One of the best ways many have found to relieve gloom during COVID-19 has been to reach out and see what others need. In working to make others happy, we have found a way to make ourselves happy in a difficult time. Adding to happiness through acts of service is perhaps our most durable source of resilience, accessible to all, regardless of level of advantage or position in life. It is a self-renewing resource. Ultimately, I think health is broadly misunderstood. We often think it is only about chemicals in the brain. But that is just a small part of what happiness is about. It is about the resources that can create a happy life. These same resources give us the resilience to bounce back in times of challenge. Durable happiness comes when we pursue these resources together. It is the spirit that grows between neighbors checking in on each other, or kids using Zoom to connect with parents, or volunteer choirs singing through nursing home windows for the isolated to hear. It is the spirit of common work for the good of all. A society that is deeply informed by the spirit is resilient indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandro. That was fascinating. I was taking lots of notes during that. I have several questions that have impromptu come up. I'm hoping that you're okay for a short Q&A.
Yeah, go ahead.
Excellent. I'll start with the COVID lens in focus, and then I'll broaden it out to much wider things. I mean, like you said, this pandemic exposes the gaps in the health system, whether it be in the US or around the world. So my first question is, how would you expect the impact of COVID on mental health problems to be different from other epidemics like SARS and MERS?
Yes, I think there are a couple of differences between COVID and SARS and MERS. The first difference is that COVID is ubiquitous in that it has really affected the whole world and whole populations, and neither SARS nor MERS did that. So when you think about health and when we think about population health, we talk about ubiquitous forces, things that affect all of us. They're like the water in our fishbowl. We don't even notice it because they're around us. And COVID has been that. It has been ubiquitous for many of us. So I think that number one, the scale and scope of COVID is just much larger than anything we've experienced before. The second part of it is that COVID is inextricable from the economic consequences of COVID. And we know that economic stressors, financial stressors, the strain of coping with limited resources is in and of itself a stressor that hurts health, that requires resources to be resilient from it and bounce back from it. So we have two different forces that are coming at the same time. One is the ubiquitous trauma and the other one is the ubiquitous stressors. And I think that puts COVID in a class of its own.
That seems very accurate. In that theme, you have written an article on the prevention and early intervention of mental health problems. And could you tell us what that entails and whether, like in the US or in the UK or in any country, in fact, people are following those guidelines?
Yeah, so we know that there will be and there is already a tremendous increase in mental health problems after COVID, both because of its ubiquitous traumatic nature and also because of its economic consequences. So the question is, what does one do about it? And I have written that there are 3 steps that one needs to take about it. Number one, it's education. It's actually discussing it. One of the challenges with mental health is that we do not acknowledge it, we do not recognize it, we do not speak about it, and as a result, we do not address it. So number one is talking about it the way we're doing here, making it clear that mental health problems are a real part of the COVID challenge. Number 2 is monitoring it, is creating systems to capture mental health problems so that we can know what is happening, so we can anticipate and we can develop services. And number 3 is creating what we call stepped care services. And that means providing each of us different opportunities to intersect with services that can help address our need. For most people who are a little bit sad, a little bit anxious, all they need is reinforcement that these symptoms are normal, that this is not a sign of mental illness. But in order to know that, those people need an opportunity to talk about it. And oftentimes things through the web, things that are facilitated to help bring mental health symptoms to light are sufficient. But then you also need systems to make sure that those who do have symptoms of mental illness, and that means where the symptoms of sadness or of anxiety, lack of sleep, of jumpiness, of traumatic symptoms are interfering with people's ability to live their lives, that they actually have access to care, that they have access to specialized care that can help them.
Speaking of this specialized care, if we are not able to do prevention for mental health issues and other issues, and if we're not able to do early interventions, then what interventions do you consider as ideal?
Yeah, well, there are a range of mental health treatments, and they include from pharmacotherapy, meaning taking pills, taking drugs, to psychotherapy, which means things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which are structured therapies administered by licensed professionals. there are a number of studies that show that these can be interchangeable, that they work in different circumstances for different people. But fundamentally, if people do have mental health problems that are interfering with their ability to get on with their daily life, they need to talk to a professional who can figure out which service is best for them.
I have a young PhD student here in clinical psychology in Oxford who has written a couple of questions for you pertaining to COVID and mental health. So I'm just going to read that. So has COVID, which is in some sense, he says, can probably be classified as a trauma, increased our vulnerability or our resilience? And are those two concepts contradictory, or can one lead to another?
I think COVID has increased our vulnerability. I think the evidence is pretty clear that traumatic events, the more severe a traumatic event is, the more deep it is, it makes us more vulnerable to the psychological consequence of the traumatic event. So in that case, I think COVID has increased our vulnerability. And the fact that COVID is accompanied by financial stressors, particularly affecting those who are already in financially marginalized situations, makes it very clear that COVID increases our vulnerability. The question about resilience, this goes back a little bit to some of my comments earlier, is what is resilience? Resilience is bouncing back. Resilience is coming back from an event. So are we able to bounce back from COVID? I'm not sure that COVID itself increases resilience. I think resilience depends on the structures we put in place as a society, and it doesn't just happen. So we will be resilient if we intervene in such a way as to help counter the influence of traumatic effects of COVID. And by that, I mean providing people with the resources they need to bounce back.
Are there any long-term effects that you ascertain from COVID to mental health and well-being in people?
The mental health consequences of an event like COVID can last for years. It is we know that most people who do develop mental health problems will resolve in a few months to a year, but a proportion, maybe a ninth, maybe a tenth, will go on to have mental health symptoms that last for years. And of course, in that group, you end up having chronic dysfunction, which is quite concerning, which is actually why it's important that anybody who has symptoms of mental illness is seen by a professional early to try to mitigate that.
So the conversation, this is again our PhD student's question. So he points out that the conversation about mental health, at least in the US, and in many other parts of the world, I was born in India, is very stigmatized. That's pre-COVID even. Do you see that changing? Do you see that getting worse? How do people seek out help? I mean, we're talking here, and you pointed out lots of things about happiness, but there are criterion that we have to meet in order to actually achieve happiness or get there, or even get the mental framework. So how do you see that stigmatization for mental health changing, and how does COVID impact that?
Yeah, I think there's no question that mental health is stigmatized, that we do not talk about mental illness anywhere near as much as we should. And in some respects, maybe a widespread event like COVID, maybe an event that is associated with broad scale mood anxiety disorders, as we expect with COVID, things like depression, things like anxiety, things like post-traumatic stress, will be a positive in terms of destigmatizing what happens, mental illness, and what happens after an event like this. Because if more people have it, ironically enough, it means it becomes less unusual and becomes something we're more willing to talk about. So there's no question that stigma and not declaring mental illness and not wanting to be known to have mental illness limits our capacity to get people to seek treatment. Will an event like this, because of its ubiquity, change that? That would be a silver lining.
You mentioned during your talk that there's a 14-year health gap in the US. If I'm correct, I think that was the data from US between the richest and the poorest Americans. So I want to expand the topic of discussion beyond COVID and move it to the greater or the broader health, including mental health. What do you think are the key ingredients that we can use to deliver, healthcare? I know you want to talk about health, which is absolutely accurate, not healthcare, but actually delivering health. How do we actually deliver health? to a population around the world that is getting older and being affected by traumatic situations like COVID?
Yeah, the population aging is really one of 2 or 3 most important demographic trends in the world. We have more people over age 65 in the world today than people under the age of 5, which is a remarkable transformation. And the question is, what challenges that represent and what opportunities it represents? So we have a resource in terms of now having a growing population that by and large is actually healthy in the late 60s, early 70s, that is retired, that has a lot of capacity to help others. At the same time, there are challenges. There is loneliness is a big challenge, which leads to mental illness, and that's an enormous challenge. So I think we need to start thinking about how we build structures that create health for a population that in 2050 looks dramatically different than it did in 2000, because 2050 you'll have 2/3 as many people who are over 65 than are under the age of 5. So I think it's going to require a wholesale culture shift towards recognizing that the modal age is an older age, not a younger age, and that means changing how you structure societies insofar as health is generated by the world around us, by where we live, by the places we live, work, and play. And insofar as people who are older have much more interaction with those places than people who are younger, it puts an extra premium, I think, on creating better places where we live, work, and play to the end of generating better health.
I hope you don't mind that I'm going to kind of focus the next few questions more from the biomedicine and biotech world where I'm more familiar with. So this is obviously focusing it on that. So William Gibson's favorite or famous quote, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." So in labs in Oxford, at the Boston University, at Harvard, at Yale, at all of the universities around the world, we have biomedical scientists like myself and other cell biologists working on, from CAR T cells to, CRISPR to other gene therapies, and all of these really amazing technologies that have the ability to transform and envision and create the world that you talk about, which is, I kind of just hinted at why you talk about health and not healthcare, because you want people to grow older in a healthful state rather than just to be treated. I'm putting words in your mouth, so please feel free to correct me. People being treated after they have a disorder, and that's as biomedical scientists, that's what we want as well. But sometimes it seems that the medicine bench to bedside, this gap is very wide. How do we? This is a very big question, but how do we actually envision this world of 2050 as you're talking about, where we can actually help 2/3 of the world's population live sustainable and lives where they can actually take care of themselves rather than needing to go to assisted living facilities or nursing homes? And how do we actually translate these transformative, to use the word, technologies and make it available to others? CAR T cell therapy is available in the US, but it's only being discussed in the UK because it's so expensive to the quote unquote healthcare system. So big question, but what are your thoughts on it?
I'm a big fan of technology. I think technology has technological innovation and has progressively created a better world. At the same time, I think we often get dazzled by high-end technology and think it's more transformative than it actually is. It takes a long time for technology to transform our lives for the better. And you refer to William Gibson, who, of course, had a very deep appreciation for the underside of putting all our eggs in a technological basket. And his writing is very evocative of the dystopias that can emerge when we elevate technology above all else. So I do think technology matters. I do think technology has potential to create a better life for all of us, by becoming more evenly distributed. But I do think it takes longer than we think. And I also think that sometimes because we're enamored of shiny objects, we all are, we all are. We forget that some of the simplest technologies are the ones that truly are transformative. Perhaps the most important technological innovation in health in the past 200 years was hand washing. That was technological innovation. Why not? It was the widespread use of a new device that ultimately transformed our health, introduced hygiene, broadly speaking, across the Western world, which eventually spread to the whole world. it's not a particularly fancy technology. So right now we're in a process of where obviously we have both the cell and molecular approaches, technological approaches. We have things in the digital world, and some of these will end up being transformative. Often very difficult to tell in the short term which ones are transformative. And I think we should be hopeful and enthusiastic about the potential of these technological changes, but at the same time, not let hope substitute for an actual plan for how we're going to create a better world. I think there is so much that we can do, need to do, to create a healthier world. There is so much that we can do to create a world that generates health right now, that we should not be putting all our eggs in any single technological basket. We respect technology, we invest in technology, and we should be open to its transformative potential, but recognizing that it's just part of a much larger picture.
So my final question is regarding, you point out that how the situation currently, the pandemic, has exposed the gaps in health system around the world. And you also talk about social capital. So if you had a few things, so a Pareto principle level of things, a few things that you could do that would actually change the gaps in health, so to speak, not just in the United States, but I'm talking about globally. What are the few things that we can do at a local level, and of course at a population and a government level, that can actually have a massive impact?
Yeah, I think fundamentally we know that achievement gaps, which become health gaps over the life course, are set early in life. So I think if one were to think about what are a few things we can do, I would start with early childhood. I would start with education. I would start with making sure that you have systems to replicate wealth transfer. Gaps in wealth create enormous social divides that then stay with populations throughout their whole life course. So I would think about education. I would think of ways to help people move beyond generational divides in wealth inequities. Think of ways to make sure that people have stable, sustainable housing and capacity to compete in a fair labor market. I mean, these are all conditions that ultimately allow us to flourish, that allow us as humans to flourish. But I would, given the choice of doing a few things, I would go back to early in childhood and create and put people on a healthy trajectory. Unfortunately, that's also politically the hardest thing to do, because of course, no politician sees the result of that in her time in power, because that takes generations to achieve. But if we really want to achieve change, fundamentally, that's what we need to do.
It was wonderful chatting with you. I know you guys have a very busy day, so I don't.
Yeah, no, our schedule's been a little bit crazy with in COVID times, but it's been an interesting.
This has been wonderful, and thank you so much for coming and chatting with us.
Excellent. Well, thank you for doing this. Thank you for inviting me.